Hi there. Good morning, good afternoon, good evening, whatever time it is. As always, happy whatever day it is. I'm Larry Erickson. This is the Erickson Report. We start by going back to something that I mentioned last time. Last show, I went into the so-called deal of the century, which others have called the steal of the century, the supposed peace deal offered by the Treaty Pie administration for peace between Israel and the Palestinians. That actually showed how it's a totally bogus attempt, which is actually intended to cement and justify continued Israeli domination of the Palestinians. I said that this time I was going to spend some time looking at the U.S. media reactions to the proposal that I called the ripoff of the century. Reactions which tell us a lot about the way in which the political and media establishments in this country view that part of the world and the people in it. I'm going to do that, but first there's an important update. One showing the agreement is not only bogus, but that the Israeli government doesn't even intend to keep the promises it made in it. J Street, which describes itself as a pro-Israel liberal group, reports that over the past week, Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu has announced plans to build thousands of settlement units in and around East Jerusalem, including several which have crossed what have been identified as red lines you must not cross, settlements that slice through Palestinian neighborhoods in the area, settlements whose construction would devastate any hope for a Palestinian state with a capital in East Jerusalem. Now, for over 2 decades, various Israeli governments have heeded advice from experts from the U.S., from other foreign countries, and refrained from crossing these red lines by making these settlements. They've undertaken other harmful settlement expansions, but until now, they have refrained from pursuing these particular ones. No more. J Street reports that Netanyahu, quoting them, has painted a clear picture of what it looks like when a government of Israel no longer even feigns interest in resolving its conflict with the Palestinians, is unbound by the rule of law, and is given an unquestioning green light by the United States. The government of Israel has outlined its plan to forever be the only sovereign state between the Jordan River and the Mediterranean Sea. So in other words, this agreement is not only a fraud, it's a lie. But I did say that I was going to talk about how major voices in the U.S. mainstream media reacted to the plan when it was released, because those reactions reflected and revealed a basic underlying assumption of that media about the conflict, which is the assumption that the Palestinians, in the end, just aren't that important. That their concerns, their hopes, their desires for justice, their economic, physical, and political condition, they just really don't matter. That they can be, like any strange object, looked at with some interest, but they ultimately remain unworthy of any significant engagement, of the expenditure of any energy or conscience. For example, the New York Times' Bret Stephens responded to the plan's announcement by writing that, quoting, nearly every time the Arab side said no, it wound up with less, which not only dumps the Palestinians and every Arab state into one undifferentiated glob, but moreover, rather than underlining Israel's my way or the highway negotiating style, it actually just demonstrated to his own satisfaction that the Palestinians should just give up and accept the plan. David Ignatius of the Washington Post disingenuously asked, Palestinian antagonism is understandable, but what alternative would they and their supporters propose? I don't know, maybe an actual Palestinian state in the West Bank and Gaza, including withdrawal of Israeli forces from the West Bank, the lifting of the embargo on Gaza, and some symbolic right of return. In other words, the same thing that the Palestinians have been offering with no response for a couple of decades now. Because remember, the Palestinians cannot even offer to recognize Israel as a state because they did that 27 years ago in a deal worked out between Yasser Arafat and Yitzhak Rabin. Similarly, the New York Times editorialized that, quoting, "This could well be the last opportunity for their own state that the Palestinians will ever have, or at least the makings of the best deal that they can expect. That may not be a just outcome, but it is perhaps becoming the realistic one." In other words, they should just give up. The idea that the U.S. and Israel should be condemned for producing this unjust outcome, that there should be a demand that they do better, that they do much better, that just doesn't rise to the level of consideration because the Palestinians are not important enough for that. Then there was Thomas Friedman of the New York Times, who advised the Palestinians to try to make some lemonade out of these Trump lemons, because it's not as if they have a lot of great options, and the resistance to Israeli occupation has gotten them nowhere. Again, they should just give up. The idea that instead of dismissing Palestinian needs as just not important enough to merit concern, the idea that instead he should be demanding that Israel do better, that Israel should do justice, is not even on the table. Instead, he would have the Palestinians say, yes, but we will use this plan as a floor in negotiation with Israelis, not a ceiling, saying that would surely get a lot of U.S., Arab, and European goodwill. Well, okay, if resistance to the occupation has gotten them nowhere, which is actually not true, it's only the resistance to the occupation that has gotten the idea of a Palestinian state being discussed at all. But if resistance to the occupation has gotten them nowhere, exactly what has acquiescence gotten them? Of course, Friedman is also the one who, in the wake of a massive Israeli assault on Gaza in 2008, an assault that, in his words, inflicted a heavy death toll on Hamas and heavy pain on the Gaza population, he was the one who said that that assault was simply a matter of educating Hamas. He was also the one who infamously said that the whole purpose of the Iraq War was to sell some country in that part of the world, and that's a quote, because it didn't have to be Iraq, he said. It could be Saudi Arabia, it could have been Pakistan. But the whole purpose was to tell some country in that part of the world, suck on this. So maybe he's not the best place to look for someone with concern for justice. And something else for which we should not look in the media is any sense at all that the U.S. has ever been anything other than a good faith actor in the conflict, has ever been anything other than a just and impartial mediator in what has passed from negotiations these past decades. Thus, the New York Times says the steal of the century is, quoting, the latest of numerous American efforts to settle the seemingly intractable conflict between Israel and the Palestinians. While the Wall Street Journal holds that, again quoting, for half a century, American presidents have tried to find a path to peace between Israel and the Palestinians. Okay, consider this. According to the Congressional Research Service, since 1946, the U.S. has given Israel over $108 billion in military aid. We are now pledged to give Israel $3.8 billion a year in military aid every year through fiscal 2028. The Congressional Research Service notes that, quoting, in 2019, Israel is more secure and prosperous than in previous decades, and yet, despite its status as a high-income country, military power, and top global weapons exporter, Israel remains largely dependent on the United States for procurement of certain key high-cost U.S. weapon systems, such as combat aircraft. Which means that if the U.S. actually wanted a path to peace, if it actually wanted to settle the seemingly intractable conflict on any kind of balance and fair terms that could do justice and provide for the security of both peoples, Israelis and Palestinians, terms that would of necessity require Israel to surrender its imperial aims on the West Bank and admit its guilt in the impoverishment of Gaza. If the U.S. actually wanted to pursue a just peace, it has the power to do so. It has the leverage to force the dominant power, that is Israel, to acknowledge and respect the rights and just aspirations of its adversary. The fact that the U.S. won't do that, the fact that even suggesting that idea seems absurd and impossible, is proof enough that the U.S. is not and has not been an honest broker in the Middle East. And the fact that there is zero chance of such an idea being discussed in the mainstream media brings us back around to Stevens, Ignatius, Friedman, and all the rest of the elite media, who are essentially united in telling the Palestinians to give in, give up, take whatever crumbs fall off the table, and don't expect or even hope for anything better, even as they spiritually starve for lack of justice. Back in 2002, Moshe Ya'alon, then Chief of Staff of the Israeli Defense Forces, told Haaretz that it needed to be, quoting him, burned into the Palestinian consciousness that they are a defeated people. That view may not yet be burned into the Palestinian consciousness, but it clearly has been burned into the consciousness of the American media. And we're taking a break. And we are back. Okay, so it develops that on February 22nd, House Speaker Nancy Pelosi visited Texas Representative Henry Cuellar at his campaign headquarters in Laredo and voiced her hope that in the party primary on March 3rd, Cuellar would achieve a resounding victory over challenger Jessica Cisneros. We assume that Henry will win, Pelosi said, but we want this to be not only a victory, but a resounding victory. Okay, Henry Cuellar is one of the most conservative Democrats in the entire Congress. He votes with Treaty Pie nearly 70% of the time. He has an A rating from the NRA. He's anti-choice. He's a top recipient of money from the private prison system and from fossil fuel lobbies. He is the first ever congressional Democrat to receive re-election support from the Americans for Prosperity Action, which is a super PAC set up by Charles Koch. And his other supporters include the American Bankers Association, the Texas Bankers Association, and the U.S. Chamber of Commerce, thoroughly wired in to corporate America and the banks. On the other hand, Jessica Cisneros is a progressive with a solid progressive platform. She is an immigration and human rights attorney who is running a union-backed campaign fueled by small donations, and she will not accept corporate money. But Nancy Pelosi and the Democratic Congressional Campaign Committee would rather have Cuellar than Cisneros on the ballot, and resoundingly so. So they want Cisneros defeated resoundingly. Even though the district is considered a safe Democratic one, in 2016, remember this is in Texas, in 2016, Hillary Clinton won this district by 20 percentage points over Treaty Pie. And in 2018, the Goppers didn't even put up a candidate, and Cuellar got 84% of the vote against a Libertarian. And this is not the only example of this, of the Democratic Party establishment rallying around one of its own over a challenger, even when that challenger represents more of what the party supposedly is all about. Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez recently tweeted that there are Democrats in safe blue seats who side with the NRA, are anti-LGBTQ+, and yet are protected because they advance the interest of big donors, fossil fuels, etc. And what's more, this is not even new. This is not even new. Here are two particularly notorious examples. In 2010, Bill Halter primaried incumbent Senator Blanche Lincoln of Arkansas. Now, Halter was no stranger. He's no radical. He was actually lieutenant governor of Arkansas at the time, but he was a little bit to her left. And he consistently outdid her in polls in head-to-head matchups against the expected Gopper candidate for the seat. Even so, the party establishment closed ranks around Lincoln to the point where in the closing days of that primary race, they openly campaigned against labor, which was supporting Halter on her behalf. With that support, she won the primary, and then exactly as the polls predicted, went on to lose in November. Even earlier, in 2006, Ned Lamont primaried Senator Joe Lieberman of Connecticut on an anti-war platform. He won the primary, upon which Lieberman immediately ran as an independent with the not entirely implicit support of the Democratic Party establishment, which gave only perfunctory support to Lamont. Lieberman won, much to the relief of the institutional Democratic Party. Listen up, people. Get it through your heads. The Democratic Party establishment is not on our side. The Nancy Pelosi's of this world are not on our side. They are not on the side of average working people, of the unemployed, of the poor, of the struggling, the victims of discrimination and bigotry, or even on the side of the future of this planet. Yes, certainly there are individuals who have been and continue to fight the good fight. In fact, I've already mentioned one. And certainly there are individuals who were or are on our side on particular issues. But as a group, as a whole, they are not. As a group, as a whole, they are on our side insofar and only insofar as it's necessary to protect their positions, their privileges, and their sinecures. They'll ignore us, fight us, and then for the sake of their own benefit, they'll try to take credit for what we have achieved. After his victory in the Nevada caucuses, Bernie Sanders tweeted of the Republican and Democratic establishments, "They can't stop us." Well, in response, longtime Democratic Party strategist Joe Lockhart tweeted, "The Democratic establishment gave us civil rights, voting rights, the assault weapons ban, Social Security, and Medicare. What have you done, Senator?" Hey, Mr. Lockhart, you didn't give us anything. We won it. All of it. Every one of those things came as the result of years, often decades, of organizing, marching, protesting, lobbying, petitioning, of letters, phone calls, court suits, nonviolent civil disobedience, and yes, voting. We did it, not you. So I turn the question back to you, Mr. Lockhart. Can anyone in the Democratic Party establishment name one gain that has not come without significant outside resistance? It's not come without significant outside pressure on you, against your resistance. Can you name one advance that originated in the upper echelons of the Democratic Party establishment? You can't, because you didn't give us squat. And you're not going to give us single-payer health insurance, a living wage, or a livable future for ourselves and our children. Remember how Nancy Pelosi snidely called the Green New Deal, quoting the Green Dream, or whatever they call it. Nobody knows what it is, but they're for it, right? Remember that? None of that. None of it will happen without us constantly pushing you, and then taking what we can get, and then coming back again and again for more. They're not on your side. Mr. Lockhart, you are not on our side. Speaking of Nancy Pelosi, I still recall with bitterness how during the Obama years, she blocked House votes on the People's Budget, which was prepared every year by the Congressional Progressive Caucus, as well as on progressive motions to end the wars in Afghanistan and Iraq, even though the motions likely wouldn't pass at that point, but blocked them because she did not want it to be visible that there was any opposition to Obama policies. And it's not just the political establishment, okay? It's the media establishment as well, which can easily be seen in the treatment of Bernie Sanders. Now, full disclosure, I supported Bernie Sanders in 2016. I'm supporting him in 2020. But what I'm addressing here is not because of him in particular. I strongly suspect that if he wasn't running, that Elizabeth Warren, who is the most progressive of those remaining outside of him, if he wasn't running, Elizabeth Warren would be getting much the same treatment, getting the same too far left, too radical, can't win line, so beloved of the pundits. Maybe it wouldn't get it to the same degree, but yeah, definitely she'd get it. You want an example? The night of the Nevada caucuses, Chris Matthews of MSNBC said, "I'm wondering if Democratic moderates want Bernie Sanders to be president. Maybe that's too exciting a question to raise. Do they want Bernie to take over the Democratic Party in perpetuity? Maybe they'd rather wait 4 years and put in a Democrat they like." In other words, he's suggesting that the Democratic Party establishment would prefer 4 more years of Tweety Pie to a Sanders presidency. During a radio interview on February 21st, MSNBC contributor and journalism professor Jason Johnson said, referring to Sanders, I'm quoting him, "I don't care how many people from the island of misfit black girls that you throw out there to defend you on a regular basis." Informed by the host that he had crossed the line, Johnson, who is African American, responded, "I don't care." Chuck Todd, host of Meet the Press, approvingly quoted a column calling Sanders supporters a digital brown shirt brigade. Chris Matthews compared Sanders' win in Nevada to the Nazi takeover of France in 1940, for which, to be fair, he apologized the next day. On February 22nd, longtime Democratic strategist James Carville called Sanders supporters fools and the same as climate deniers for feeling that the excitement that his campaign generates could bring out people who don't normally vote. And then, of course, there is the plethora of Sanders is just the same as Trump stories, all of which has the unstated subhead of, so if you think Tweety Pie is too extreme, you have to think the same thing about Sanders. A typical example came from Fred Hyatt, editorial page editor of The Washington Post, declaring in his own paper on February 23rd that Sanders and Tweety Pie both reject the reality of climate change. How? Well, Tweety Pie, of course, by considering it a hoax, while Sanders does it by the fantasy extremism of his climate plan. In other words, his thing is he's just like Tweety Pie because he takes climate change too seriously. And who does Hyatt rely on for a non-extreme plan? Turns out the CEO of Total Oil, one of the 7 largest oil companies in the world. But nothing illustrates his bias as clearly as the foofara over Sanders being pushed on a statement he made in 1985, praising some aspects of the rule of Fidel Castro, specifically his literacy program in healthcare. He's been asked at least twice about it in town halls by the media. He's been attacked not only by Democrats in Florida, but some of his opponents for the nomination for offering anything other than unreserved condemnation for anything and everything to do with Fidel Castro. All right, first, leaving aside the question of whether people will or should even care about some opinion he expressed 35 years ago, the utter dishonesty of how this has been dealt with in the media, I originally was going to call it appalling, but I think telling is a much better word. All right, first consider this. Cubans not only have the highest life expectancy in the region, they are among the top 5 in the entire world. In 2014, the country was, by the Director General of the World Health Organization, praised as a world leader in the medical sphere. UNESCO has rated Cuba as the best education system in Latin America. The literacy rate is 99.8%. Simply put, what Bernie Sanders said in 1985, what to his credit he has not backed down from, it was true. He did not endorse Castro's regime. He did not excuse the oppression. He did not embrace the political imprisonment. He did not embrace the denial of freedoms. But he did make a true statement about certain social programs. And as he said, truth is truth. But truth is not good enough. Truth is not a defense when it comes to referring to those who the political and cultural establishment have declared to be beyond the pale, nor is it a defense when the speaker is the outsider, a threat to that establishment. One final proof of this? You want one more proof? Okay. A quote. Castro brought superb systems of healthcare and education to his people. That was Jimmy Carter in 2002. The United States recognizes the progress that Cuba has made as a nation, its enormous achievements in education and health care. That was Barack Obama speaking in Cuba on March 21st, 2016. Do you recall any major uproar about either of those? Do you recall either of these men being read out of political life on the grounds that they were embracing a dictator? Of course not, because it didn't happen, because neither of them was thought to be an outsider. Neither of them was thought to be a threat to that establishment. And so Sanders continues to get pummeled. not because he lied, but because he spoke an unpopular truth, or more importantly, more to the point and more importantly, he spoke a truth that the media and the Democratic Party establishment are trying to turn into an unpopular truth. Not because they want to crush Bernie Sanders in particular, but because they want to crush any challenge to their social and political hegemony. They are not on our side. And they will continue to be not on our side, to ignore us, to dismiss us, to deny us, as the Lord of the Manor denied the bastard son he had by the servant girl, even though that boy would be the legitimate heir, or to bring it back to reality. They will continue to deny us even as we represent the majority, until we make it impossible for them to continue to do so. There is much to be gained, much to strive for. Allies and alliances to be gained and lost, and many unavoidable compromises along the way. But never forget, they're not on our side. All right, we finish now with two things. 2 weeks of stupid, clowns, and outrages. I only have time for one each, so this time I'm starting with the outrage. On February 25th, the Supreme Court ruled 5-4 to slam the courthouse door in the face of the parents of a Mexican teenager who was shot down over the border by an American agent. The court's 5 radical right-wingers held that the parents could not sue in American courts. They could not sue a border agent who killed their 15-year-old unarmed son in 2010. Writing for the court, Justice Samuel Alito said the case is tragic, but that strong border security and international relations issues led to the ruling. Since regulating the conduct of agents at the border unquestionably has national security implications, he wrote, the risk of undermining border security provides reason to hesitate about allowing the suit. Okay, this is utterly insane. National security implications? What are the national security implications of telling Border Patrol you can't just start shooting at people in Mexico without consequences? Here's a security implication for you. What are the security implications for the Mexicans on the other side of the border when the Supreme Court says, in effect, that U.S. government officials can kill Mexican teenagers with impunity? All they have to do is claim someone was throwing rocks at them, and even though the video of the incident says otherwise, they walk. And impunity is exactly what we are talking about. U.S. officials refused to prosecute Mesa, the agent in question. The Obama administration, note Obama, not Tweety Pie, the Obama administration refused to request to extradite him so he could face charges in Mexico. When the parents of the boy tried to sue Mesa, federal judges dismissed their claims, and now the Supreme Court has done it with finality. And the boy lies dead, the parents are left to mourn with no recourse, and nobody except the parents pays any price because national security. All right, I'll end up with a clown, which will take no time at all because just saying it is enough. Expansion is not required. Rush Limburger has stated that the intelligence used to justify the invasion of Iraq in 2003 was faked by the deep state in order to sucker George Bush the Lesser into invading Iraq so he'd be embarrassed when no weapons of mass destruction were found. That's it. We're out of here. We will see you in 2 weeks. Until then, as always, peace.